Okay, so this is presentation 1, Worlds Collide, Europe, Africa, and America, 1450 to 1620. So we start with the shaping of North America, and start off with a concept called Pangaea. That's where all of the Earth's continents were joined together. That's what scientists think the world used to look like, the continents used to look like. Pangaea is Latin for supercontinent. And so this is about 225 million years ago, not very long in terms of geological time scale. Over time, though, the continents broke apart and drifted apart. That's known as continental drift. So we get to the present day. Now, so what, you might say? The big deal about this is the isolation of North and South America from the rest of the continents. This is going to be really crucial when we talk about people migrating into North and South America. So North and South America were isolated, but there was a time about 35,000 years ago, and this is during the Great Ice Age, which lasted a couple of million years. And about 35,000 years ago, the glaciers caused sea levels to drop. And they dropped in this area right here, the Bering Straits. And so the sea level dropped, and land that is below the sea was briefly above the water. And we call that the land bridge, and the ancestors of Native Americans migrated from Siberia into North America. Understand that we believe that this went on for about 250 centuries, or 2,500 years, and then the sea levels went back to the way they were, and North and South America were closed off again. Understand also that other people have different theories. There are lots of different theories about how America became populated. This is the most popular, the one that most people believe. There are a variety of theories, and every now and then something shows up that doesn't fit our timeline or our understanding. For example, I saw online the other day that a Viking ship had been discovered in a Missouri river. Try explaining that one away. So as the glaciers retreated, the first Americans migrated slowly through the Bering Strait and made their way down through what is now North America, and gradually into Mexico, Central America, and finally into South America. By 1492, there were perhaps as many as 54 million Native Americans living in North and South America. Now, this number is heavily disputed, and the reason it's disputed is that historians have kind of argued about how many Native Americans died when Europeans came over. Most historians accept about a 90% death rate for Native Americans who came into contact with Europeans, largely because of disease. So some historians have said that there were as many as 100 million Native Americans. Some historians have said there were as few as 8 million. The middle number that a lot of historians agree on is 54 million Native Americans. But understand that there's going to be a huge casualty rate. So it almost doesn't matter how many Native Americans were here, but understand we have about a 90% casualty rate based on contact with Europeans and disease. One of the things we want to emphasize, obviously, is the wide variety of Native American cultures in North and South America. And these cultures are going to develop differently, and some of them are become increasingly complex by adapting to and transforming their environments. In the southwest, we get the spread of maize cultivation, and this maize cultivation had spread northward from Mexico. And the spread of maize cultivation from present-day Mexico northward into the American Southwest and beyond supported economic development and social diversification among societies in these areas. In the Northwest and California, what we're going to see is a similar thing, but here we're not relying on maize cultivation in the Northwest and California, we're relying on a mix of foraging and hunting. So let's talk about a couple of examples. In the Southwest, we'll talk about the Pueblos. And the Pueblos were called that by the Spanish. The Pueblos lived in these little villages, these adobe dwellings that were made into the environment that they lived. And Pueblo is Spanish for village. The economy was based on agriculture, and we have extensive evidence that the Pueblos traded with Native Americans that were quite a distance away from them. In the Great Basin and the Great Plains area of the United States, Native Americans there are going to live quite differently. They don't have the natural resources for agriculture, so we're going to see more mobile societies in this area. In the Northeast and along the Atlantic seaboard, some societies are going to develop a mixed agricultural and hunter-gatherer economy that favors the development of permanent villages. The example here would be in New York, where we get the Iroquois nations. The Iroquois, of course, was a grouping of 5 separate Native American nations. And the Iroquois are going to be quite a power player in terms of diplomacy up until the 1700s in American history. So, in 1492, we have a wide variety of different cultures. In Central and South America, we have the Inca and the Aztec, very impressive cultures, heavily dependent on corn cultivation, maize cultivation. And corn cultivation does explain a lot of the development of Native American groups. However, if we focus on 1492, the Aztec and the Inca are really exceptions. Most North American Native Americans live in scattered and impermanent settlements in 1492. Let's talk a little bit about Europe before Columbus. Europe in about the 1400s, early 1500s, was very, very weak. It was very, very divided. If you remember World History 2, you talk about the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages, where things like the Black Death ravaged Europe and that kind of thing. We'll also talk about a couple of early quote-unquote failures, and these are Europeans trying to expand before Columbus. So Columbus wasn't the first European to go adventuring, and in fact he wasn't even the first European in North America. That distinction goes to the Vikings. The Norse landed in the 10th century. Leif Erikson founded a colony known as Vinland. Basically failed because it did not have a lot of backing from a powerful, strong state back in Europe. Okay, and that's going to be the biggest difference between Columbus and someone like Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson is kind of just a random adventurer who happens to land in North America. There's no strong, unified country backing his efforts to colonize anywhere. Columbus, it's a different matter. By the time Columbus sets sail, Spain is becoming a strong country and wants to establish itself. You might recognize those guys from the 11th to the 14th centuries. Tens of thousands of Europeans tried to retake the Holy Land from Muslims. So these Europeans were Christians who went on crusades. And this is from the 11th through the 14th centuries, and there were several crusades. For our purposes, what's important here is the trade goods that were brought back from the Crusades. Crusaders went to the Middle East, brought stuff back with them to Europe, and these goods became highly prized and highly valued. They were also highly priced. Marco Polo was another man who was important. In 1295, he was an Italian adventurer. He returned to Europe in 1295 and told tales that he had spent almost 20 years in China. Historians really debate whether he did that, but it probably doesn't matter whether he did or he didn't. The fact was, his story excited Europeans, the story of the strange land in China, the strange things that grew there, the strange animals, the strange trade goods. And his description of rose-tinted pearls, golden pagodas, stimulated European desires for a cheaper route to the treasures of the East. So, Eastern goods, if we look at this map, Eastern goods traveled mainly across land, and that's a map that shows the Crusades, but remember that what we see here is goods as well. So here are the Crusade routes, but this is the Middle East, and things that were traded with Western Europe would have to go across land. This made them very, very expensive. And what we have are middlemen. Every time a trade good passes through a set of merchants, the price goes up. So, by the time we get to the 1400s, Europeans are looking for an alternative route for trade routes. In the 1400s, the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was expanding, and these trade routes were becoming more and more expensive for Europeans. Europeans are looking for a different route. The first country that we talk about is Portugal. And Africa was the focus of the Portuguese. The Portuguese were trying to get to the Indies, India. And before 1450, Europeans didn't travel very far. But by 1450, there's a couple of things that Europeans have discovered. Number one, they've built new ships called caravels, which allowed them to travel further distances. Number two, they've also figured out the winds in the Atlantic Ocean. So they've figured out how to get further down the African coast. And you can see the 1400s are really a story of how Portugal slowly but surely gets around Africa. And finally, of course, with Vasco da Gama, they reach India and establish trading stations there. So when I talk about trade winds, what am I talking about? I'm talking about here. So here's Portugal, right here. And Portugal's trying to figure out how to get around Africa. And the Portuguese gradually stop at more and more parts of Africa. Now, if they trade with African people and go back to Europe, they can't just sail back north because the winds blow in this clockwise direction. These are called trade winds, and it takes human beings a long time to figure out these trade winds. And before the Industrial Revolution with steamships and so forth, it's vital that you know the trade winds, because if you don't, your ship won't go anywhere, or it'll go to the wrong place. So when the Portuguese are figuring out how to get further and further south in Africa to get back home to Europe, they actually have to sail away from Europe, and then the winds will gradually blow them back. So what the Portuguese do in the 1400s is set up trading posts, and on this map those little arrows are trading posts that the Portuguese set up, and you can see by the late 1400s they were getting closer and closer to rounding the Cape of Good Hope and getting around Africa to India. I want to draw your attention to some small islands that today are really nice tourist places, although I've never been to any of them, but they're really good places to stay. They're beautiful islands with tropical climates. These little islands were kind of like North and South America, in that they had been isolated. So when the Portuguese landed in the Azores, when they landed in Madeira, when they landed in the Cape Verde Islands, the Portuguese met native peoples who were pretty much still living in the Stone Age, and they had absolutely no immunity to diseases that the Portuguese would bring over from Europe. As a result, when the Portuguese tried to put these islanders to work, alright, the Portuguese are going to claim these islands, take these islands, and try to grow food on these islands, especially sugar. The islanders are going to die off in huge numbers. So, the Portuguese need people to work on these islands. They are trading in Africa. Africa at the time had its own healthy slave trade. So the Portuguese start buying slaves from Africa, and we get the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, slavery is as old as man itself. The problem is the Atlantic slave trade becomes something that's tied up with race. At this point in Europe's history, slavery had been abolished. So the Portuguese are going to be the first European country to take slaves from Africa and put them to work on these islands. And a couple of key explorers. 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounds the tip of Africa, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. So the Portuguese are the earliest country that we talk about in terms of colonization. They were the country that was leading the way. But what about Columbus, you say? All right, Columbus was sailing for Spain, so we want to talk about obviously 1492. The problem is, before 1492, there was no such thing as Spain. Spain was a collection of separate countries. It became unified in 1492 only when two things happened. Ferdinand and Isabella had gotten married and unified the two biggest areas, Castile and Aragon. And in 1492, the two of them reconquered part of Spain that had been held by Muslims, and you'd probably learned about this in World History 1. So 1492 is a significant date, not just because Columbus is going to, purely by chance, land in the New World. It's also important because Spain is a unified country. Spain is competing with Portugal, and Spain has unified this area and is strong and is ready to move. I want to emphasize the competition with its neighbor Portugal. Portugal had been getting rich from setting up these trading posts, and like Portugal, Spain would like to go straight to India and the East Indies and trade. So here is the known world in 1492, the known world to Europeans. Okay, so the Europeans know about, obviously, their own continent, and they know about the Middle East, where the Crusades were. They know about India, they know about China, they know about the Spice Islands, and they know about Africa. And they know about Iceland and Greenland because the Norse have been there. What they don't know is that these two continents are right here. Now, in the late 1400s, most people who travelled on the sea knew that the world was round. So Columbus guesses that if he sails from Europe, rather than going east like the Portuguese have gone, if he goes west, he thinks he's going to land pretty quickly at China. And he makes some very impressive scientific calculations, and they're all completely wrong because he has no clue that North and South America are there. So Columbus, there he is, nice looking man. Columbus is going to pitch this idea, and it's a crazy idea because it's very counterintuitive. What Columbus is saying is, we're going to go east by going west. And he tries to go to England, he tries to go to Italy, and both of those countries send him away. Finally, Spain is going to listen to him. So Columbus is going to receive some backing from the Spanish and set out with ships to find the Indies, find China. And October 12th, 1492, Columbus and his men sighted an island in what we now know as the Bahamas. Columbus had no clue where he was. He thought he was in the Indies, which is why he called the people on the island where he landed, Hispaniola, he called them Indios, meaning Indians. We still call Native Americans that today sometimes. I'll often call Native Americans Indians, and that stems from Columbus's mistake. Columbus had in fact not found a western route to the Indies. He had in fact bumped into an enormous land barrier blocking his path. Columbus went to his grave not understanding this. Columbus thought he was in the East Indies and thought he was getting closer to China. So in some ways, Columbus is successful, obviously, but he's also a successful failure. For decades afterwards, Europeans tried to get around these continents. Once people figured out these continents were in fact there and weren't moving, Europeans tried to look for a quick way to get to China. So you'll often maybe read about things like the Northwest Passage, where people would try and sail up to the Arctic to find a path through to China. (1492) is also significant because it is going to see something called the Columbian Exchange. So when Columbus goes over to the New World and lands in the New World, he is bringing stuff over with him. He's bringing European food, things like wheat. He's bringing disease. He doesn't know he is. He's also bringing animals, probably the things that caused more damage than anything else to Native Americans were animals that got loose, especially pigs. Animals that got loose and roamed in the wild and spread diseases. Again, I want to emphasize, we think about 90% of Native Americans are going to die either through warfare or most of them to European diseases. Obviously, stuff is going to come back the other way. And this is going to, the Columbian exchange of food and people and ideas is going to transform the world as we know it. So one of the things to think about is that this has tremendous influence on what's going to come. Obviously, part of this exchange is going to be, we're going to see diseases, and we're going to see goods, and we're going to see food, and we're going to see animals. Disease is brought back. Some of the things to think about, some of the stuff that's brought to, say, Europe and Africa becomes really important. So we get this weird situation. Africa is going to provide a lot of slaves, but some of the food stuff that's sent to Africa via the Columbian exchange is going to lead to population growth. So we have this weird thing where slavery is going to depopulate part of Africa, but better food is going to lead to population growth and actually kind of even things out a little bit. Gradually, Europeans are going to realize how important the discovery is. And obviously Spain and Portugal, being good Catholic countries, go to the Pope to settle the dispute over who should have the rights to the new world that's been discovered. The Pope is going to draw an arbitrary line. He really has no clue what he's doing. Draws an arbitrary line on a map, and purely by chance happens to give most of these discoveries to the Spanish. Everything to the west of the line was given to Spain, everything to the east to Portugal. Spain is going to become the dominant power of the 1500s. Spanish conquistadors are going to fan out across the Caribbean and eventually onto mainland American continents. So we start off in the Caribbean, and then gradually the Spanish are going to colonize Central and South America and plant the first colonies in North America, St. Augustine being the oldest European settlement. And these islands are the bases that the Spanish use for the invasion of South and Central America. And of course, you should know, these guys, you probably remember them from World History 2. Balboa is going to be hailed as the discoverer of the Pacific Ocean. Ferdinand Magellan is the guy who circumnavigates the globe from 1519 to 1522. Ponce de Leon and Coronado are going to go off on little expeditions into North America looking for gold. And the two most famous of the conquistadors, Cortez and Pizarro, are going to conquer the Aztecs and the Incas. So I'll end with these points. By 1600, Spain is incredibly powerful and is incredibly rich. One of the things that's going to be discovered in the New World, in places like Mexico, in places like Peru, is silver. This silver is going to be mined by the Spanish, taken back to Europe. What it leads to is inflation in Europe, where we're basically putting new money into the European economy. It leads to a price revolution. It's also going to stimulate trade.